Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's expert webinar, Hacking Your Windows IT Environments. My name is Ross McDermott, and I am one of the pre-sales engineers here for Netwrix. I'd also like to welcome today our expert speaker, Liam. So welcome, Liam.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
No problem. So it's good to hear what you've got to talk to us today about hacking your environments. Looking forward to it. Just before we begin, just a few house rules. So everybody is on mute. So this is just to minimize any background noise. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. We will try to answer these throughout. But also, we will have a Q&A session towards the end as well. You would also receive a copy of the slides today and a copy of the webinar. So there will be a follow-up email with the link to where this will then be posted. The webinar should last no more than 60 minutes. We will obviously try not to overrun, as we do realise your time is precious. Really hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Again, any feedback you have, please feel free to let us know. But just before I turn this over to Liam, we do also have a prize draw today for some Amazon gift vouchers for 4 lucky attendees. And these will then randomly be drawn at the end. Also, you must be present at the end of the webinar to be eligible to win. And we will then contact you afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to hand this all over to Liam.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody. I'm excited to kind of walk through this stuff with you today. So on our agenda, we're going to focus on some specific categories of content. The first one, we're going to talk about attacks, and really this will be focusing on understanding the attacks, the types of methods that are being used, and then really focusing on what the exploitation process is, and exploitation being the mechanism that's used to actually break into something. What we'll then do is we'll also talk about overall protections, just 2 basic areas, one being patch management, and then also general protections that we can apply into our environments to kind of mitigate against some of those attacks that we talk about. And then lastly, we'll talk about monitoring and talk about some general approaches, and then we'll turn it back to Russ to go through and talk about some of the Netwrix capabilities. So let's talk about understanding attacks. Now, of course, when you're looking after your internal IT infrastructure, one of the most important things is to really recognize and understand, one, who we're protecting from, what we're trying to protect from, and also the different types of attacks that are currently available to malicious targets that may want to come in, or as they're referred to as those actors that are kind of doing things. So first off, to kind of understand it, I wanted to talk about 3 specific words. The first one is vulnerability, the second one is threat, and the third one is exploit. Now, you often see these 3 words go together, especially if you're working through some of the tutorials and also some of the documentation about attack mechanisms and things like that. So when we look at each one of these, a vulnerability is really an entry point into an application or something even like a hardware device, lots of these IoT devices that we have. And basically, it's a mechanism that's used that the application or hardware was not intended to allow. So attackers use the vulnerability to glean information about security defenses, and they typically use it as part of solving a puzzle. So there was a news article recently that came out where they were able to, break into some environments by using an IoT device that was inside a fish tank. So they were able to break into machines using a device that regulates temperatures. So these devices and also applications have inherent vulnerabilities ever so often. The next piece is the exploit. Now, the exploit is normally the creation or the created element. Maybe it's a piece of code, maybe it's an executable, maybe it's some kind of virus, whatever it would be. An exploit is the piece that takes advantage of the vulnerability. So, for example, if you have a web server and there's a cross-site scripting vulnerability, then the exploit would be the packaged version of that so that me as a hacker, for example, could do something. It could just be a Python script, it could be something else. And then, of course, the other word is threat. Now, the threat is quite interesting because this is completely hypothetical. The threat is something may or may not happen based on a potential vulnerability and a potential threat, which you may or may not know. That sounds really bizarre that you know, it's kind of up in the air. We're not quite sure what it would be, but that's what it is. The threat or the threat level that you should associate to applications and hardware devices and products that you have in your organization is really that. What are the odds of there being a vulnerability? What are the odds of there being an exploit? Now, when we talk about the different types of attacks, there are some common ones that I'm sure you're aware of. The first one is phishing. This one is still one of the most successful attacks that can be done, because it's not really an attack. It's really exploiting a vulnerability of us as human beings and the ability for us to kind of just accept something and do something. I mean, I'm sure if we was to unmute all of you and say, give me the name of one person in your organization that will always click on a phishing email, you probably know who that person would be. There's always at least one. When I worked in a company a few years ago, most of the people that opened it, believe it or not, were salespeople. Just because if you crafted the right email that looked like it was a potential opportunity, they were going to click that email whether you told them to click it or not. So phishing emails become quite successful, especially when you combine them also with a clone of a website, for example. So, you know, in a webinar last week, I did an example of where we can send a phishing email, and when the email gets there, they click a link and it takes them to a login page which they're used to going to. So, for example, it could be a Facebook login, it could be a Microsoft 365 or Office 365 page login, but actually when they get there, it's not quite the same and the URLs are different, but if you craft it just right, nobody ever checks it. And so phishing is really based on, I'm expecting the end user to make a mistake. The second most popular, which actually seems to be quite common still, even after all these years, is SQL injection. And really that's just based around the fact that the application code has not been built the way it should do, and it means that I can put values into text fields in web pages and have it automatically bring back information that it shouldn't do because the code isn't parameterizing or cleaning out or looking through the content to make sure that it's the right values that should be passed. Cross-site scripting is getting less than it should be. There are still applications that are vulnerable to this, but most of the browser manufacturers are doing well at fixing some of this. So cross-site scripting can often get blocked by the browser itself. Then, of course, malware. Malware over the past year has been really, really popular. Things like crypto malware, that type of stuff, where it's a combination of maybe a phishing email, which has a link to a page that when you get there, it downloads malware, then the malware launches, and then crypto locks your machine. And I'm sure we all have read the news and seen the host of companies and organizations that have just paid to have that fixed. Session hijacking. Obviously, the ability to jump into somebody else's session, you know, so obviously I'm using an icon of a cookie there because most of the session information is cookie based. So I'm going to steal the cookies and then I'm going to be able to replay those sessions as the individual user that was there. Man in the middle is still a common attack, not as popular right now, just purely based on it's a bit more complicated to do, and it involves, you know, maybe if I'm doing a Wi-Fi man-in-the-middle attack type thing, then I'm going to have another device that launches a spoofed Wi-Fi network, and then I'm going to have to connect, and then I'm going to have to strip some SSL and do a whole bunch of other stuff too. Now, there are great devices that let you do that, or you can do that on Linux, for example. So it's still an attack. Credential reuse is actually majorly popular, especially when you can go online and download some of the largest password files ever created. You know, for example, the historical one was the LinkedIn one, you know, X million passwords that were in there. So it's the ability for me to, you know, once I can find a valid email address or an account name, then it's a matter of finding the credential and then trying that on other applications, because that is one of the biggest issues right now. I speak to lots of people about this, just, you know, end users at organizations where their password that they set has been reused multiple times into various other locations. You know, maybe you log into Facebook, Gmail, Hotmail, and something else with the same password, just because it's easier to remember. Obviously, the downside to that is I get your password, I can literally just reuse those credentials, those passwords again. And then, of course, denial of service. That one's been around for a long time. It's an interesting one because it's not really an attack as such. It's an attack on an application to kind of take it down. But what's happened over the past few instances is that the denial of service is basically something that is making noise while something else is happening. So if you are attacked for a denial of service, what you should check is that any number of the other things listed here are not being done at the same time. Denial of service is literally all about making noise and taking the sites down. Now, for example, for you guys, there are ways that you guys and hackers can kind of look at the specific attack methods. One of the first things that people would do, whether you're a hacker, a gray hat, a white hat, a green hat, a red hat, a blue hat, whatever it would be, is that you test for manual access. You look at the application and say, well, let me just go to it. Let me just see what I can find. I mean, for example, there was that one a long time ago, the guy here in the States went to the AT&T website, so the mobile phone provider, and managed to figure out that just by looking at the URLs, he could then write a script that would let him do something that he shouldn't have done. He ended up getting arrested for that, but you can test that manual access first. Then, of course, you're going to do a brute force. So this is where we're going to pass large password files, account lists, whatever it would be, and try and brute force into the web application or whatever that would be. That's not always successful. It's very hard to do a brute force web access unless you have a pretty good idea of the types of credentials that are being used. You also have what's called authentication tests, which comes as part of that brute force. So, for example, it's simply just, I'm going to just keep banging on the door with sets of credentials until something wins. You know, maybe I'm going to use something like rainbow tables because I have a password hash or something else and kind of work through that process. One of the other tests that's always great is to do a web service scan. You know, what's on there? What's in that environment? What services are running? What components are available? Because you might be banging on the wrong door because the web service piece might actually be solid, but you may be able to break into some other component. Database attacks, they can be quite popular as well because normally that's where most of the data is stored. In most environments, the database server tends to be hidden back behind everything else, so it's not always the easiest to get to. However, internal attacks on SQL servers, for example, is quite common because everybody knows that SQL Server runs on 1433 as a TCP port and 1434 as a UDP port. And if you didn't know that, you could Google it and the answer would be there very, very quickly. Then I can download a tool that will literally scan the entire network looking for database servers, and then you can go through the process of attacking at that point. But if I can attack a database, so for example, one of the popular collaboration tools on premises is based around the SharePoint tools. SharePoint is nothing without a database. So if I can break the database server, I don't need to compromise the web application. I just take the SQL Server database with me. And then, of course, an interesting one is the remote desktop test. I actually asked a question while I was giving a presentation at a conference the other week and said to all the people from the IT groups that were there and said, if I was to plug into your network with a laptop, could I ping the servers? And of course, the answer was yes. And then I said, well, can I also initiate a remote desktop session to those servers? And they said, yes. And he said, obviously, you wouldn't get in because your account wouldn't work. And so my question back was, why are you allowing client machines on the network to ping the servers and to remote desktop to them for no apparent reason? Even though they can't get in, why is that even available as an option to them? So then we talked about how to mitigate around some of that by using some of the firewall stuff that we'll talk about later. Now, from the client side, obviously, we can, if we're looking at a web application or some application, then the controls that are rendered on the pages can be some of those pieces where you look at those controls and you can interrogate them. Lots of web applications tend to use hidden fields in the source of the page. And so if you're thinking like a hacker and you want to get into something, often what you can do is view the source code of the page at runtime and look for the hidden fields, and then you can start to do other bits and pieces with those controls. Obviously, authentication, you can do the same tests with authentication, throw in tokens at it or whatever else it would be, trying to get around what the authentication mechanism. And we can also obviously look at sessions and capturing the web sessions and being able to modify what's going on. Then, of course, you have all of the back-end components that you can try to get to, which normally in a client-side application attack, it's quite hard because you don't tend to be near the back-end components. Obviously, the users are always the great way of attacking. I mean, if we go back through history and look at some of the big hacks or the big leaks that have taken place over the years, most of those were done because a user did something. So, for example, I'm working with a client recently where they had Microsoft Office 365, so cloud service, all protected. And then we got a phone call because they had been hacked. And so the logic was, well, hold on a minute, like what did they hack? And they didn't hack Office 365. What they did is they hacked a different organization where this company had given vendor credentials to this other company. And the vendor credentials were for their Office 365 tenant. And they obviously had elevated permissions to do certain things. So when those accounts were compromised, this hacker group knew Office 365 very well, logged in, and did a whole bunch of stuff inside the environment. But the failure was down to the users, but it was bad passwords. They didn't have complex, there was no multi-factor authentication and things like that. So there were some things that could have been done to mitigate. And then, of course, you can also attack web applications directly. So going through, looking at maybe it's calling REST API calls. That has been one that's become quite popular again. I remember all those years ago working as a software developer, many, many moons ago, and we would use XML HTTP requests that would kind of do a similar thing. And then everybody said that was bad and it all went away. And now we're full circle back to it again using REST APIs, which basically does the same thing now. But you can see those. I can open up a web application in something like Fiddler or Burp Suite, whatever it is, and I can see what's being called all the way through. And it's a matter of dissecting how the data gets backwards and forwards. And that's actually a good test for mobile device applications too. You know, seeing what those applications are calling out to and if they're secure or not. Because if they're not secure, then you can utilize pulling that information out too. So once we understand the attacks, the types of attacks that are there, there's obviously a specific attack process that you would go through. So if I'm putting my hacker hat on for a minute and I want to target your organization, I'm going to try and scan from the edge. I'm going to scan from the outside, knowing that that's probably not the entrance. So let's be realistic about it. Most firewalls do a great job, so it's probably going to block me at that point. But there will be open ports, which is useful because it's good to know what traffic is allowed in and out. I'm then going to scan for IP ranges. So maybe I want to know what IP addresses are being used. So if I'm sitting on the outside, it's just going to be public IP addresses unless I can get through the firewall somehow. But if I'm sitting on the inside, maybe I'm a disgruntled employee or I'm officially there to do a penetration test, for example, then I'm going to scan all the subnets to find out what's available. Then I'm going to scan for devices. So once I've got the IP ranges, I'm going to run some kind of scan that's going to show me active IP addresses instead of give me every single IP address. You know, if you've got 255 IP addresses or whatever, like, or, you know, I don't want to be scanning through all of that. So I don't want to just come back and say they don't work. So I want to say, show me the ones that respond actively. And then I can then interrogate and scan for devices and say, well, I'm looking for something that exists on there. Once I've done that, then I can look for specific application attacks. So maybe I'm looking for servers, maybe I'm looking for phones. It's actually quite interesting that we use these IP phones. I actually did a test a while ago just inside our own network, and it was interesting to do a scan and find out that the phone system, all the phones were communicating over IP protocol to the master, excuse me. But what it was also doing was sending a unique address of the phone, but it was also sending credentials that it needed to log in. And unfortunately, at that point, it was being sent as plain text. And I could see this account credential being sent through the IP phone to whatever the device was it was connecting to. That's subsequently been fixed, but that was something that was there. Often Active Directory is the core target here. In an ideal world, if you can attack Active Directory, then you're good to go, because basically you just create an account, a backdoor account that leaves you sitting there, and you can access whatever you need to at that point. And then, of course, a database attack. So if I was logically flowing through, scan the firewall, scan the IP, scan for devices, application attacks, and if I can get into the network, then I'm going to focus on Active Directory and database attacks. You know, I'm going to try and dump down account credentials or something else, or attack SQL and then have SQL Server do something on my behalf. Now, when we scan, we're going to do what's called ping sweeps. So I'm going to send ICMP TCP packets to just return active devices and servers. I can also then do port scans, so looking for protocol-specific interrogation devices, so port 80, SSL, 3389, whatever it would be. And then also I can do what's called inverse mapping. So exclude devices and servers that don't respond. So we can kind of map these together. Now, the downside to some of this is that it makes noise. So if I suddenly came into your organization, plugged the laptop in and started doing ping sweeps across the network, if you had something that was able to capture that, that's making a lot of noise on the network. So as a hacker, tester, whatever it would be, you try to minimize the noise that can be done. So we'll talk a bit more about scanning shortly as well. So the exploitation process. So I've gone through and looked at the attacks that I want to do. I've gone through and figured out my initial set of targets. The exploitation steps is to identify the vulnerability. So once I've figured out, let's say it's Windows Server 2016 or Windows 10 or something else, you figure out that's a device, you figure out some ports are open, and you identify a vulnerability. Now, the publicly disclosed vulnerabilities ultimately end up with a CVE reference number. So you can actually go to cvedetails.com as a website and actually put in the application that you're looking for, and it will give you the most current CVE issues. And then you can test those first based on that. The odds are the application hasn't been patched yet. Once we've identified the exploit that we wish to use, so the vulnerability, let's say, is a buffer overflow, a memory overflow, for example, using PowerShell, I'm going to identify an exploit. I'm going to use PowerSploit, maybe Metasploit, and I'm going to identify those two. Then I'm going to create the payload, and the payload is whatever I want to send. So in this scenario, it could be an executable file, it could be a document, it could be a crafted link, or it could be just that you're using a known exploit and vulnerability that lets me just remotely bang on the door and get straight through. Then we're going to generate the code that needs to go with that. And then we select a module framework that we want to use. So I talked about things like PowerSploit, it could be Metasploit, it could be Mimikatz, it could be something else. And then we ultimately end up creating a listener. And that's the goal here. You want to have a listener so that when someone does something in the environment, it connects back to your machine as the hacker, the tester, so that then you can then do other things under the covers. So in a logical flow, we use a remote access exploit, which basically lets me connect across. It gets saved and executed. And then out of that, it launches a remote shell, which is what I want to connect to. So I'm going to say, here's my package. I want to send it out, and I want to create this remote shell. And I want to be able to deliver that using a remote web. So I create my little package, which is my weapon delivery that I'm going to use. So let's say it's an executable, just for argument's sake. I go through, package my weapon and say, I want to launch a remote shell to my machine, and the way that I want you to get to that is by clicking a remote website that does something. And then the remote command is executed, and then the backdoor then gets opened at that point. So in the diagram, it looks very simple, but obviously there's lots of different steps that go in between then that might need to happen. You might have to join certain things together to make it work. For example, you might have to do an exploit that gets you in, then use a different exploit to do something else, and then use a different exploit somewhere else. Now, one of the things that we tried to do here when we talked about scanning was to minimize the noise. So one of the options that we have is what's called pivoting. So pivoting, if we look at our infrastructure, so I'm going to have my network here just connected. So let me just draw out my infrastructure right here. So what we have on the left is my machine. On the right, I have the servers I'm trying to get to. I have the subnets on the left and the right, which would determine what's going on. And then in the middle, we have something that's referred to as the proxy. Now, what that actually is for me as the hacker, I have no direct access to the far right-hand side, which is the corporate network. But what I have been able to do is utilize a proxy request, which basically, let's say that was a phishing attack, and that's a client workstation on the network. So let's say that that's my device. A hacker sent me an email. I clicked on it. I didn't know what went on, but something happened, and now I have this open on the hacker machine. So the hacker can now use my machine as the pivot target. So what actually happens here is I use what's called a Meterpreter scan to say, from my hacker machine, let's say I'm sitting in an internet cafe somewhere, I launch Meterpreter scan, I tell it to route that down this connection that I've now got to a machine that's inside the corporate network, and then I tell that corporate machine to go and do something on my behalf. I want you to go ahead and scan the subnets and bring back whatever's there. So I can then do what's called run get local subnet, and it will return me the subnets that exist behind the workstation that I can't see. So that means I'm able to pivot, use that machine as a pivot machine. And of course, what's great about that is that it looks like normal traffic. So that means that when anybody's looking at the network, it just looks like a workstation is doing normal traffic. So what this does, you can see that this returns the subnet range that I can't see, and then that allows me to then add rules into my interpreter scan. For example, adding a kind of routing rule that would say whenever I want to connect to 192.168.111 or whatever it be, route it through that proxy one in the middle. So it's a very, very powerful way of doing it. It means that it's much harder to be tracked and picked up. Now, the commands that you use are really simple. So this is where we would be using Metasploit to do that. It's one of the easiest tools. So what that means is I'm going to connect everything in. I already have exploited the device. I'm then going to say run get local subnet, which goes and gets the subnet. I'm then going to background that process. Then I'm going to add a route and say, hey, for this route, I want you to send all the traffic over that current session to the other network so that I can do stuff. And then from here, I can say, get me the IP config of what the box is, which is the box I've compromised. And then I can do what's called ARP scanner. And I can say, now go and scan everything behind the machine that I can't see. And then this will return everything that I can play with. Then I can just add routes and kind of go backwards and forwards at that point. So that's kind of step one. You create this idea of pivoting traffic backwards and forwards. Once we have that, then we have a similar approach where once we have a connection, we can actually do what's called port forwarding instead. So in this instance, I have the device in the middle. Let's say it's a workstation again, but instead of pivoting it, I'm actually going to just forward targets to whatever it would be. So let's say I have my connection and I've now done my ARP scanner and I've got the subnets from the right. I can say, well, actually on my hacker machine in the internet cafe, whenever I try to do a remote desktop session to port 3389, I want you to route that through that other box to an IP address in the other subnet. So that now means my remote desktop session basically gets tunneled all the way through and it comes back to my hacker device. So that means I can forward those ports to the other network that I'm not able to see. To forward the commands, it's going to be using something that's called port forward. And then basically I'm going to say the listener is the 3389, the port is 3389, and then the target on the other network that I got from the ARP scanner, I can now do that. And then that gives me a list of what's there. And then from my Linux machine, I can say R desktop, and then I can get a remote desktop session that's tunneled all the way through. Once again, it just looks like normal traffic. It just looks like that the workstation in the office is just doing normal stuff. Now that's great. That gives me a remote desktop session, but I still have to break in. Unless I have credentials. So one of the other options is to do what's called token stealing and impersonation. So once again, we're back to the same infrastructure again, where I'm on a different subnet to the others. And what we're able to do is I can then use what's called incognito, which is a module we can load in the Metasploit framework, that basically I can connect across to one of the servers with a console from the relay and say, hey, list me all of the tokens. And what I mean by tokens is the applications that are running on that server. So for example, let's say they have Notepad open on the server for whatever reason. Notepad would be listed as an executable that's running along with the account that's running that application. So same thing for Windows services and bits and pieces like that. What I'm able to do is to get a list of those tokens and then impersonate that token. So for example, I could be logged in as a normal user account. I can get to the server for whatever reason, but I don't have access to do anything dangerous. So I actually want to elevate to a different account. So I can pick using tools from the Linux machine all the way through the relay into a session on the server and say, impersonate this other person, and then I'm able to do something at that point. The commands, I'm going to use PS, which is a standard one to get me a list of all the processes on the machines. I'm then going to see the list of them, and I'm going to use steal_token and use the PID reference, and then just connect. And then I'm going to use load incognito at that point, which will then, I can then list the tokens, and I can use impersonate_token, and then whatever that user would be. Then that makes me that user. In a previous example, at a conference I was doing, I went through the same process and was able to elevate as the domain administrator, because the domain administrator had logged in, had something running. I can steal the session, the token, and then I'm able to run other things at that point. So that was just 3 different types of things. So how do you protect your environment? For me, the first one is this. It's all about patching. It's about patching your Windows environment. There are 3 different types of patches that are available. One is called a global patch. So we talk about Windows, so global patch. These are critical operating system updates, and there's lots of news when these come out, and these are patches that should be applied. Then we have what's called limited release patches. These are from the field patches that Microsoft do. Normally, they're just specific ones around a specific issue. You know, maybe your client, you know, you have Windows, you logged a ticket with Microsoft, you said there was a support issue. Microsoft recognized it as an actual problem, so they wrote a limited release patch. And then, of course, you have the monthly roll-ups. And so these are the standard full all release patches in one go. So 3 different types that we need to worry about. Now, when it comes to patching them, though, there's a kind of a thought process that I kind of go through. The first one is only install patches that match the current level that you're on. So don't try to skip like 57 patches. Some vendors will say you can do that, and obviously work with the vendors. And of course, if the patch resolves the current issue, or if the patch is a security update. So those are the 3 reasons that I would patch something. On the other side, I wouldn't patch it unless the current service pack doesn't deploy it. So for example, if you move to a cumulative update and then there's a specific patch that isn't part of that, then you might want to patch that. Or maybe it's multiple hot fixes versus latest released service. Maybe you don't want to do like a big patch in one go. You want to do the smaller ones. Or maybe you have inconsistency across the servers. So, you know, like I've seen it in too many farms, for example, where not all the servers are patched at the right level. So really it's about patching to resolve an issue, patching security updates, and patching where it matches the right level. Now, from the general protection, there's some base kind of protections that we can put in place that will help us control and mitigate some of the issues. The first one is the application firewall. It's not so much of an issue now, but historically people would turn off the Windows firewall for whatever reason, or they wouldn't necessarily have a great firewall at the beginning. So application firewalls work well, perimeter firewalls work well, and then operating system firewalls. When those are joined together, that gives you 3 layers of protection. And really, the end person coming into an application is really just hitting an edge firewall and being allowed to use a specific protocol. We should be inspecting all the traffic in some way. We should have access control, and we should be monitoring what's going on. We need to be more proactive instead of reactive. Most of the people I speak to over the past few years, you know, they aren't looking at log files like they should do. They often ignore the emails that come in from a monitoring platform because there's often too many of them, and they're just like, I'll be fine. But we need to be more proactive about the types of things that we do. Now, if we're protecting devices, so phones and cell phones and routers and firewalls, same thing again. We can have device firewalls. We can have perimeter firewalls to protect coming into the devices. We can also do port blocking, so blocking those ports that are not being used or that don't need to be available externally. Then, of course, we have the same rule again, inspect all the traffic, also go through and access control the traffic to make sure. So, for example, I should never be able to walk into your organization with a random laptop, plug it into a random network port and be on your network. Like, that should never happen. Like, it should be protected and I should be blocked from that. And then, of course, monitoring again. Now, from the infrastructure side, same kind of flow diagram again. So we have the batch of servers. Same thing again, application firewall, perimeter firewall, operating system firewall, inspect the traffic, access control, and monitoring. The principles are the same. You can see it's all about firewall protection on the one side, and then the piece that you have to do on the other side, which is inspecting, access control, and monitoring. Now, what we can do in an infrastructure is do what's called server isolation and then port control. Server isolation is a function of Windows Firewall. It used to be something we would do as IPsec policies. So, for example, if you have 10 servers that need to communicate as part of a farm, then you isolate the traffic to those 10 servers. If there's no other servers that need to talk to that, then you don't allow servers to communicate to that. If my workstation doesn't need to communicate to the physical servers, only through a port-controlled access firewall, then block the access for the client workstations, because I don't need to be remote desktop into the servers if I'm just an end user, because that's just opening a door and all I have to do is download a brute force tool and then start playing. The same as the port control, kind of blocking the ports that are visible to anybody who's not in that specific group. We can also go one step higher, and we can start doing process whitelisting. So this allows me to block specific ports and allow specific ports. So I can allow executables, specific paths, and also scripts. And I can also block any of those too. So this is a bit more complicated. You'll be using something, for example, like App Locker within Windows to kind of manage that, to control that. It just means that you kind of have to understand how that works. Now, even with all of those bits and pieces in place, one of the biggest issues and risks is all about escalation of privileges. But this can be managed by doing what's called privilege access management, or PAM. PAM allows us to do isolation of privileges, and then we can set up and proof up. So kind of we have an account and we kind of move up to when we need the access. There's a customizable workflow that can be used, and then additional logging can be added. Now, what this kind of means is that we have our corporate domain, and then we have what's called our Bastion domain. The Bastion domain is the domain that actually is going to have the access to whatever we need to get to. So what happens at this point is we have a trust between the two domains. So, for example, I am corp/group, and then we also have an equivalent one, which is Bastion-group, and it's what's called a shadow principal. So the shadow principal is the actual account that we would be using to connect to information, and the SIDs get mapped between the two identities. Now, this is part of the Windows infrastructure, and this handles this itself. So that means that corp/group doesn't necessarily have access to do something, but Bastion/group does, and it can be granted via the workflow process to say, hey, I want just-in-time access, then it gets granted that way. So the request for access is asked. So I'm going to come in and say, I'm IT, I need access to that server. There's an approval process that goes in. The permissions are then assigned for a time-restricted access grant only. So that means my Bastion account gets access, and I'm able to log into the infrastructure. This is the same kind of process that Microsoft use in their Microsoft Azure data centers for their support engineers to actually have access. Where they are not given standing access, they have to have what's this just-in-time access. Now, the next level above that is to do what's called privilege access workstations. So the workstations themselves provide a dedicated operating system for the specific types of attacks. Tasks, not attacks. Separating these tasks and accounts from the normal workstation will protect from various types of attacks. And we have what's called tier 0, tier 1, and tier 2. So if we have our 3 tiers, we have an admin workstation that's associated to each of those tiers. And then, for example, you can see the difference in the tiers. So tier 0 is Active Directory, high visibility, high importance servers. Then in tier 1, we have regular servers, and then tier 2 is workstation. So you can see the difference here that tier 0 is all about forest and domain admins. Tier 1 is server admins, and tier 2 is all workstation admin stuff. So what I'm able to do is if I'm in tier 0 and I'm trying to get to the Active Directory, then it's the same tier logon, so I'm able to get access. But if I'm using a tier 1 admin account to get to there, that's a higher tier login and that will get blocked. If I try to come down from tier 1 and get into the workstations, that's a lower tier login and that's blocked too. So there's a flow here of you have to be in the right tier to manage. Now, this does make things much more complicated because you obviously have to have specific workstations, but these could be virtual machines that you connect into. But obviously you have specific accounts and tiers that can do stuff. It just means that you go to the designated workstation to administer the sections of your network servers that you need to administer, instead of, well, I have one machine that lets me do everything. Now, once we have all of the protections in place and we've built the workstations and we've tested everything, then the key is really about monitoring. It's all about being proactive. So looking at the security event log in Windows to look for those odd things that might come up. Looking at the firewall logs is important, and then looking at auditing logs if you've enabled it. Now, of course, Windows has a great set of auditing capabilities that are available. Obviously, some of those can be pushed into group policies and then applied to the servers. So that means I can get security events, I can do firewall logs, I can do auditing, and kind of consume that all together. Now, of course, there are other products out there where you can join this together, you know, whether it's into something like System Center or some other third-party application, whatever it would be, to join these together to do a better job at reporting. Let's be realistic about it. Looking at the event logs in Windows is not the most glamorous task ever. Looking at raw firewall logs is not the most glamorous, and definitely auditing logs are not glamorous either. So having something else that lets you do that, at least in a user-friendly approach, will be much better. Now, from the categories, you want to be monitoring high-value accounts. So, and that doesn't necessarily mean service accounts, but it might. It just be a high-value account. Is it the CEO's account? Is it the CFO? Is it those type of accounts? You obviously want to monitor for anomalies or malicious actions of some description. What's great about some of the new firewalls and the new technology, especially in the cloud, is that it uses machine learning for this. So as the end user goes in and interacts with the application, it's building a picture of what regular activity is. And then when someone does something that's very, very different to that, it gets flagged as an anomaly or a malicious action. Look for non-active accounts. So looking for an account that hasn't logged in for a while that still seems to be a valid account, or looking for active accounts that suddenly have become active again. Obviously account whitelisting as well. So setting a set of accounts that are allowed and then blocking everything else and monitoring for that. Look for different account types that might be created, because when accounts are being created by some kind of hacker or whatever else, they're going to try and create accounts in various different ways to try and get around any of the policies that might be there. Look for external accounts that suddenly get created, something that you don't recognize. Restricted use accounts or device accounts. Keep an eye on those accounts to make sure that they're not just randomly logging in all over the place. You know, obviously one of the tests that we often do is, you know, what's called the impossible logon. You know, like an account logs in, for example, here where I am in Virginia, and then 30 seconds later it logs in China. You know, we all know that that technically is possible if I'm remoting across the network and connecting into something, but 9 times out of 10, that's an impossible logon. So looking at those accounts and making sure. And then the interesting one is account naming conventions. It's often important to check this because you may have a naming convention that you use, but often when somebody is trying to break into your environment or is successful in creating accounts, they are often just using a scripted process and they don't always follow the same naming conventions as you would have. Now, one of the things that is useful is to do alerts, and obviously alerts are quite powerful. PowerShell is a great tool for that in Windows. So I can use get win event, and then you can see that I'm going to the security log and I'm getting some information out. I'm getting SAM account and everything else and dumping it down as an object so that I can filter the security event log for specific events without actually having to go into the event log. I can just use PowerShell for that. Now, one of the other options that we've got is also I can send those details as an email. So for example, I could use PowerShell again to basically go and connect and grab that same filter of information and then send it to me in an email. So these are things that you can just do out of the box. So I can go in and just, have a scheduled task that runs a PowerShell that just ever so often dumps down a specific log and sends it to me if you don't have some mechanism to kind of do that. So that's kind of a basic idea of how that works. So I suppose the most important thing is really understanding the attack types first, then working through some of the mitigations of what we can do around that one after we understand how the exploitation process works, and then protecting and deciding how secure you want to go, and then from a monitoring perspective, understanding where to monitor at that point. So I'm going to turn it back over now to Russell to talk through how Netwrix Auditor can help in that process too.
Yeah, thanks a lot there, Liam. A lot of great information now. So let's run through a demonstration of the Netwrix Auditor and how we can help you, protect your environment and show you the kind of activities that your users are doing within your infrastructure. So let me just jump over to my lab environment. So those of you that may not be familiar with Netwrix, so we are an auditing platform, looking at giving you complete visibility around user behavior analysis, and also risk mitigation. We can then look at the kind of activities that you're doing or your users are doing. A lot of cool information you can then pull in through the reporter within here. So to begin with, for example, some of our reports that we take around Active Directory and file servers, we also take what's called configuration snapshots. So you can then potentially run an IT risk assessment overview to look at some key aspects around your environment. So again, look at things like stale accounts within your Active Directory, users which haven't logged on over a set period of time. Just waiting for my report to load up. So we can then look into those key aspects around your Active Directory and file server. So look at users' computers, which is Active Directory. Again, things like permissions, which is AD, and around your data, which is your file servers. So here you can then look for things like inactive users. So as an example, in my environment, I can see I've got 24 users which haven't logged on for a specified period of time. And by default, this report is looking for enabled accounts which haven't logged on for the last 35 days. So I've got lots of users here which have never logged on, which could then be potential security threats. So maybe you want to start looking at disabling these accounts or removing them altogether if these users no longer work for the company. But you can also then see the last logon timestamp of that person as well, for those users that were active. But as well as using the IT risk assessment reports here, again, looking at things like direct permissions on your files and folders. So looking at setting up things like at least privileged access, and then monitoring access areas where your users might have those direct permissions. So rather than granting direct access, locking these users down via security groups on those particular folders. But if we look at from a least privilege perspective, if I just jump to my file server reports, looking from the state in times perspective, looking at the account permissions. So here you can review the account permissions to ensure that that permissions are assigned to each user account according to the employer's role, and that no permissions are assigned, for example, to the everyone group or the authenticated users, maybe anonymous logons. So looking at high risk groups where they could be potentially being used. But you could also use this report after an attack to determine which files the infected account had access to. So then, in order to outline the potential areas of infection. So, for example, if an account had become compromised, I could simply type that user into the filter, rerun the report, and then look at what kind of access that person had. So here I can now see all of my folders where he had access into, his permissions level. So I see things like my marketing and finance. He only ever had read access into those locations, as well as the exhibitions and seminars directory. But I can see, he had full control over to other areas. So maybe you want to start looking at these the access attempts in these locations to see whether any data maybe had been stolen. But as well as just looking at the folders, you can also go down to the file of the file levels as well. So rerunning the report. Actually, just to speed that up a little bit, let me just drop that one out of the equation. So you can also go down to that level as well as looking into files within those locations and what kind of control that user had to those files. But you can also review everyone's access across your files and folders. So looking at things like the folder permissions report. So you can see again, what account permissions are then associated with particular critical files and shares, and how those permissions are assigned to users either directly or through group membership. So for example, here again, if I drop down to subfolders, I'm going to keep inherited objects hidden. And with the group membership expanded, I can then look at the individual users which have got access at a particular folder level. Maybe I wanted to again look at a particular sensitive location, perhaps accounting directories, maybe locations to your HR directories. So then verify all of those users which have got access to their data, again, what permissions they have and how they've also been associated access. So from those that have direct permissions to those which are within a group. And you can also then drill down here. So if I'm running the Active Directory module, I could also then verify the group membership of a particular user and all the security groups that they're in. But as well as looking at group memberships and security, maybe looking at things like excessive access as well. So here you can identify users that don't use their permissions for accessing files. So for example, here if I jump into this particular report, again, maybe I wanted to look at key locations, or perhaps a particular user. So I'm going to drill down to my user C Finch again. I'm going to look at the activity over the last 160 days. Now I could also keep the times access set to 0, so I can then look at any locations where he doesn't access any data, but I could also access, put a value into the times accessed. So here I can then review that user's permissions to all those relevant locations across my accounting directory. Again, his permissions, how it's also been granted. But here I can then see, his active locations to anywhere where he's not accessing any files. So, for example, looking at my accounting guidelines, maybe I want to revoke his permissions from this directory as he doesn't use his permissions to access any data there, or maybe just dropping down to read-only access. But you can also then verify, what kind of activity a user is doing in a particular location by then drilling down into those access attempts. So then see the activity that's taken place. For example, maybe you only have a read data on that location, so I could potentially just drop him down to read-only access. But I can see he does modify data within that location as well. But as well as looking at things like permissions across your files and folders, it's also good to review things like software restriction policies, which are also being set up. So here we go to the Active Directory module and look at things like group policy changes. You can review any changes which may be being done to your software restriction policies. Oh, I did do some earlier on today. I don't think it's just updated in my environment. Let me just run an update there. Bear with me 1 moment. Let me just run an update and I'll come back to the software restrictions report once that's completed. But just moving on from there as well as looking at software restriction policies, you can also look at alerting to detect around things like threat patterns. So if I go into the alerting platform, so there's a lot of predefined alerts when you install Netwrix. So maybe you wanted to be alerted around things like ransomware activity, or is a user perhaps breaching a threshold of certain file server activity. So here if I filter down to my file server alerts, around ransomware activity, setting up threshold-based alerting around excessive files being deleted, modified, read, or renamed, but also monitoring those users which could be doing those excessive actions as well. So for example, looking at the excessive files being deleted, it's a very simple alert which is then being built up, which is looking at files being removed from my file servers. But under the threshold, you can then specify when you want that alert to be triggered. So for example, here I'm looking for any individual person, which is set to the WHO. Looking at the amount of activity records to be deleted. So here it's set to 10. And obviously, 10 files being deleted within 60 seconds, it will then notify me around that action. But you can also then add in risk scores as well. Maybe you want to specify an alert being a high risk or a low risk. Simply adjusting the slider, you can then make that change. But any alerts which have this enabled become visible under the behavior anomalies dashboard. So it's another nice area where you can monitor alerts in action. But also looking around things like Active Directory, monitoring changes to your most privileged groups. So perhaps you wanted to be alerted if there's a member being added to a privileged group. So again, looking at the filters, here we're then monitoring your domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins, and any actions which are then happening around those areas. But there are also predefined alerts which then monitor both actions as well. So if anyone's been added or removed from a particular group, but you could also generate your own alerts as well. Maybe I want to build alerts around another key privileged group which I want to monitor. Again, security groups which could be locking down sensitive locations, and you want to monitor those kind of actions that are happening there. Or maybe around things like brute force attacks as well. So looking at those multiple failed logons. So again, here you're looking at those threshold-based alerting. So if anyone generates X amount of failed logon activity within your environment within a specified time period, again, also being alerted around those actions. Or maybe you wanted to be alerted around those threshold-based alerts, again, failed logon attempts to your SQL server. So again, is anyone trying to access your SQL servers to potentially steal any databases? But let me just quickly jump back to the group policy reports. Let's see if we've got it in there. Yeah, okay, so here we've got our software restriction policy. So, monitoring things, monitoring your policies there to see whether anything could be happening. So again, who's making those changes, when it happened, obviously where it took place as well. So you're getting those who, what, where, when details. So here I can see that a new software restriction policy has been created, and then looking at all the settings which have then been enabled within that policy. Again, could anyone be potentially modifying those policies, which is then, allowing users to maybe run executable files, for example, from their workstation. But also looking at things like the recovery of files and folders being deleted. So under the activity reports for your file servers, here we can then monitor things like, again, all files and folders which have been deleted within your environment. Again, who's doing those actions? What were the files that were deleted? What was the workstation that person was logged onto? So for your Windows file servers, we're also giving you generate that workstation where that user was logged on, as well as having a session ID. And this session ID would then be linked to that individual user. So you could then pull back all the actions by a particular person at that time that they were logged on. So maybe I wanted to drop this into the interactive search engine. And it's a very good area where you can then pull back all the activity around a person to see what else has been happening. Or also from a perspective of Windows servers as well. So looking at those date and time snapshots. So here you can then get an inventory of your endpoints. Again, looking at things like the OS version, the antivirus version, to ensure that they're up to date. So here you can then baseline, what programs are installed. So for example, I can then see that my OS all meet a certain baseline. But I do have some issues around my servers around the antivirus programs, whereas I don't have any of these programs installed. So here we're then looking at the top 5, which is ESET, Kaspersky, Symantec, Sophos, and Trend. But you can obviously add in additional antivirus programs or OS version numbers into the baseline. Maybe you wanted to go down to the particular build of a recent update that was released, so you can then see what servers aren't matching that baseline. But if we go to the interactive search engine, so again, this is a good area where you can then monitor the actions of a particular person. Maybe want to do a simple query, for example, put in a particular person. Again, if an account has been compromised, to then look at all the actions which has then happened by that user. And then also looking at the results here, I can now filter these down. So maybe I wanted to look at a particular aspect, maybe a particular module, an area, maybe by file servers. So you can now start interacting with these results. Perhaps I wanted to look at all the places that person has logged on. Or for example, here, maybe I wanted to look at all the activity that's happened across my group policies, or maybe my Active Directory, for example, or perhaps on my particular server, DC901. So I can now filter down to all those actions. Maybe I now wanted to look at all the modifications which have happened. So I can then use these filters to get to the root cause of a problem to see what's happened. So, as another example here, I can then see that there was a modification to my enterprise admins group and then what member had been added into that group. I do realize that we are on close to the hour, so I am going to just jump back over to the other slides again. So we don't want to take up too much of your time. So also we're giving you a little bit of an insight into Netwrix Auditor today and what it can do. But we are auditing Active Directory, Azure AD. So if you've got a hybrid solution, we can look at Active Directory on premise and in the cloud. We also audit your Exchange environments, Office 365, your Windows file servers, EMC, NetApp filers, SharePoint. Perhaps you want to audit structured data. So looking at Oracle databases, SQL Server, as well as Windows Server configuration changes and VMware configuration changes as well. So what are the next steps? Well, certainly contact Computer World or Netwrix if you would like to make any further inquiries around the application. Netwrix is available as a standalone installer. You can then install this on the server of your own choice, or you can then run a free trial. We also do provide a pre-built virtual appliance as well, which is available to download. But if you don't want to deploy Netwrix in your own environment, maybe you just want to get a feel for the products, we do also offer a test drive as well, where you can then test the products, without that need to install it. And also, again, you've got many other pre-recorded webinars on our website as well. So if you like what you've seen today, maybe you want to look at something else, please feel free to visit our website to look at those other recordings. But I'd like to thank you all for attending, but just before we announce the winners of the Amazon gift cards, just want to see if there are any questions, but I'm not seeing anything that is coming in, but do feel free to pop any questions in there. Just waiting for the list of the winners. Okay, I've been given those. So today's lucky winners are Rob Englefield, Jamie Davidson, Darren Perry, and Erin Teacher, if I'm pronouncing that right. So congratulations. Those Amazon cards will be out on their way to you. Obviously, our team will be in touch. I'd also like to thank again Liam for today's presentation. It's been very, 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 very interesting. A lot of good information there. So thank you again, Liam.
Cool. Thank you for having us again.
And again, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's session.